Today's New Testament study, and for you guys, we take questions at the end. I have chosen a unique name, the microscope of reality, and I chose that name because of a recent conversation I had with some other friends of mine from college 35 years ago who are not in this walk and were asking me a number of questions, and a number of the answers I gave dealt with the reality of the first and second century, the way people lived their lives. So I don't know, it just kind of came to me as a good title. So first we're going to talk about what it is. Then I have a review, which is going to be very quick. We've got to mention the millennial kingdom and the Torah. And then finally we're going to do my timeline, which is very impressive, Dave. This is for you, that's because you're going to be doing a PowerPoint presentation, and you should be very impressed with it. Okay, so I have an analogy I like. I hope it's close enough. I chose microscope because everybody who has dealt with general science in school, some people in their careers, know that the microscope is used as a tool for examination, and we need to use it in the same way. I'm using it kind of as a metaphor, but the reality is we need to examine the things that took place. What was said versus what took place is kind of the thing. You can interpret what somebody says sometimes more than one way if they say it in a general sense. But if you want to find out what took place, you look at the reality, and then you understand, you can go back and interpret properly. So that's why this is talking about interpretation through the microscope of reality. Okay, I have an analogy here. Many of us are familiar with some of the history prior to the beginning of World War II. When Adolf Hitler came to power, one of the things he did initially was to sign a non-aggression pact against Poland, or with Poland, in 1934, and he did this for political reasons. He wanted to have a chance to rearm without anybody getting upset. The rest of Europe was in a passive mode, so this worked to his ability. A person reading the non-aggression pact would come away with interpretation that that meant that he would not have an aggressive posture against Poland. Problem was, it only lasted for 5 years. In September 1st of 1939, as history has dictated, or has related to us, he invaded Poland. All right? So, looking back at the document that he signed, non-aggression didn't really mean non-aggression, since the reality of what happened demonstrated aggression. And I wanted to show that just because something's written, the way you interpret it, you need to look at the reality of how it plays out before you lock down what the interpretation means. And this is one of the things that I've had to battle with, coming from a Southern Baptist background and dealing with Hebrew roots. And I'm not going to give the information, but they did the same thing with Russia, non-aggression pact, and then they attacked Russia. So, all right, here's the review. Acts 15, these are things we've already covered in previous meetings, so this is just to refresh your memory. Acts 15, I was taught that Gentiles have to do 4 things and that's it. Obviously that is very ridiculous, but once we go back and deal with Leviticus 17 and 18, we find out that the same thing with Moses deals with the Gentiles coming in. They got to have a place to start. 1 Corinthians 5, 6 through 8, you remember that Paul said, let us keep the feast. Well, there's been a lot of twisting and turning to try to get that to not be let's keep the feast, but that hasn't worked out well. In Acts 21, Paul and James get together to discuss some issues. There have been some rumors circulating that Paul, in his letters, has been teaching that you are not to keep the law. But he made it clear that he was going to do these things. James said in verse 24, if you do these things, then everyone will know the rumors are false and that you are keeping Torah and that you are walking the way you should walk. So we've gotten through that. Clement of Rome. Clement of Rome was a bishop at the end of the 1st century, and while we have talked about him in a very minimal sense, I had some quotes that I wanted to tell you about that are going to help set the stage for reality. And I'll tell you why. I was under a misconception, and I'm going to share that with you, but first I want to quote 1 Clement. This is around chapter 40 and 41. Whatever the Lord has commanded us to perform, we ought to do it in accordance with the appointed seasons. Okay, well, what might be an appointed season? He continues, he commanded the offerings and services to be performed conscientiously, and not at random or without order, but at appointed seasons. All right? Now, this quote is in Dr. Carrington's book, and he says, since Clement goes on to refer to the high priest, the priests, and the Levites, it's clear that the appointed seasons, which he regards as essential, must be those of the Levitical law. Now, I know that Clement was at the end of the first century, and I also understand that the temple was destroyed sometime around AD 70. I took that without doing any study whatsoever. I took that to mean that the sacrifices ended. I didn't know I was wrong. Okay? The sacrifices continued. I did not know this until recent. I'll have the evidence for you later. But that makes what Clement says, it actually makes sense now. That's why this is here. Dr. Carrington goes on to say, if words have any meaning at all, a liturgical year of the Hebrew type must have been well established in Rome and Corinth by the 90s. Now, I'm not worried about Corinth. We already addressed that with 1 Corinthians 5. But the fact that a liturgical year in which way we're going to Jerusalem for the 3 feasts to do the sacrifices from Rome was like shocking to my system. Very shocking to my system. His final quote is, there is no reason to think that there ever was a form of Christianity anywhere which dispensed with this calendar. I was just like, man, now it is making sense. The sacrifices, if you would like to look into more information on the sacrifices, Worship in the Jerusalem Temple in AD 70 by Dr. Clark is in New Testament Studies. And from the rabbinic side, the temple and sacrifice in rabbinic Judaism is by J.R. Brown, and this talks about it from the rabbinic side. So we have 2 different sides coming in. That ends that part. Now let's go continue with our review. Galatians 5 and circumcision. This is where we looked at the text to discover that the word circumcision did not mean just circumcision, the cutting of the flesh. So we understood that there was a proselyte conversion issue, and we addressed that. That was last month. Then Matthew 5:17. While I have a lot of Christian scholars who have commented on this, I'm only going to give one. This is from the International Critical Commentary, which was the commentary of standard for the last century, the 20th century. And here's what they said. In Matthew 5:17, the meaning of the words is clear. Christ did not come to overthrow the authority of the Mosaic law, which was to be eternally binding upon the hearts and consciences of men. Excuse me, this is Protestant Christian scholars that wrote this. So long as the world lasted, its authority was to be permanent. And then they get a little sharp with their own friends. Commentators have exhausted their ingenuity in attempts to explain away this passage, but its meaning is too clear to be misunderstood. So Matthew 17 does not provide us with a problem. Galatians 5 does not provide us with a problem. Colossians 2, 14 through 23, but especially in 16 and 17, used to provide us with a major problem, but not anymore. In an evaluation, and this kind of falls on the heels of the new perspective of Paul, which is happening within Christian scholarship the last 50 years, who is Paul warning against? As we found, he was warning against somebody coming in and telling these people, these believers in Colossae, who were Gentiles, that you are feasting too much during the feast. Well, that's just bad. All right? We also discussed the problem of translations, are versus we, were, are versus were. The Greek text is, the festival, new moons, and Sabbaths are a shadow of things to come. The New International Version says these things were a shadow of things to come. We already addressed grammar is important, especially in verb tenses. Don't want to mislead people. But we have a new problem. If you read the NIV and the NAS in Acts 18:21, this is what it says. But as he left, he promised, notice my brackets in yellow, I will come back if it's God's will. Then he set sail from Ephesus. But what about the KJV and the ISR and the Greek New Testament? But bade them farewell, saying, I must by all means keep this feast that cometh in Jerusalem, but I will return again unto you if God will, and he sailed from Ephesus. The yellow is what's been removed from the text. Okay, and anybody who has a question, here's UBS. Number 3, it's all the Greek New Testament, has all the critical textual commentary. Anybody who wants to check me. The extra words, there's a study done in Novum Testamentum. This is available in the library locally in Richmond. It's called The Extra Words in Acts 18:21.